In the past, I believed that dreams were how the brain processed daily events, but when I read some facts about them, I changed my mind. I used to joke about it, until the dreams began. It all started with a small murmur in the middle of the night. Lying in bed, immobile, I heard a distant whisper in my ear. "He is coming." I opened my eyes, sweating and my heart pounding. I tried to reassure myself that it was just my imagination and nothing more, but the whisper persisted each night. Then one day, the voice was louder at night. "He is near." Even when I opened my eyes, I felt as if someone was observing me. Sometimes I felt shapes and movements out of the corner of my eye, but when I looked around, nothing was there. I stopped sleeping and began to spend nights awake, feeding myself with coffee and energy drinks, but the weakness overpowered me, and the dreams were back in full force. This time, I was not being alone in the room at the house. A figure was standing at the foot of my bed and wearing a black cloak. I could not see the face, but those two red eyes piercing through the darkness seemed to penetrate right through my spirit. I tried to open my mouth to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. As the figure advanced, I became aware of a damp hand gripping my calf. I sat up abruptly, choking on air, but nothing could erase the feeling of that hand. Frustrated with having no answers, I sought information on anything related to dreams. I found similar narratives of people who said their nightmares came to life. They said when the figure comes into contact with you, it becomes possible for it to gain entry into your world. At first, I thought that it was just my imagination, but when I looked down at my ankle, there was a bruise in the shape of a hand. I started to panic and thought that I no longer knew the difference between dreams and reality. Again, I attempted to keep awake at night, but it became easier for sleep to pull me in each night. The visits grew more often, and the whispers louder, undefined in just how I can define them. One night, I realized my bedroom door was ajar. My chest tightened as I straightened up and turned my gaze towards the door. I saw the figure. It entered the room, and the temperature dropped immediately. I was paralyzed, unable to utter a single word. It was as if the shadows themselves were wearing me down. The figure stood in front of me with red, hate-filled eyes. "You cannot get away," it whispered. The hand reached out, and this time I felt it on my chest, a heavy weight crushing the air out of me. I found myself enveloped in darkness and being pulled into a void. When I woke up, I was not in my room again. It was always dark, and I was surrounded by horror. The figure stood before me, its form more defined now. It smelled, and we could see its mouth filled with rows of teeth like long, sharp knives. "Welcome to the dream," it said, and suddenly I knew that I was not dreaming after all. This was my new reality, a nightmare from which there was no waking. I was confined here in the dark, with a figure that had been lurking in my nightmares for eternity. I used to think I understood what dreams were, but now I am sure that it is a door to the nightmares, to the place where darkness reigns. And once they have you, there is no way to free oneself from their grasp. My fingers trembled as I write it down. It all began when I discovered the journal in the attic. I recently found myself living in an old house, and while rummaging around the place, I came across a rather worn book. Inside it was packed with very detailed dream narratives. The main character is a woman named Evelyn, who shares her nightmares that gradually become more sinister. Every story depicted her encounters with a mysterious man who became more threatening each night. I should have put the journal down, but I felt pulled to continue reading it. The kind of dreams that Evelyn had were unlike any kind of dreams I had ever heard of. She paints a picture of a tall man with no face, only a black space instead of a face. He plagued her sleep. He was calling her name, and he was telling her things she did not wish to hear. In one of the parts, she described how he pursued her everywhere she went, and his presence became even more intense at night. Curiosity gave way to obsession, and before I knew it, all I could think about was the dreams. I began experiencing some difficulties in sleeping, and then the dreams started. I started subtly. I could sometimes wake up in places that were unfamiliar to me, like those silvery low-light streets or corridors with doors to unknown rooms. In these dreams, I was so scared. Something was lurking in the shadows, ready to grab me at any moment. Each time I opened my eyes, the sensation remained, clinging to me as a layer of perspiration. Once, I was walking alone at night, and suddenly, I was in an old, worn-out house, but it was very much similar to the house I am living in now. As I wandered about, I picked up on things that I read in Evelyn's diary. The wallpaper was damaged, and the floor was squeaky. As I ventured into a poorly lit corridor, my pulse raced, and creaking floorboards whispered beneath my feet. And then I saw him. The man that Evelyn had told me about was standing at the end of the hall, in the shadows. He was tall, with no emotion on his face, and it seemed that there was no one behind his face. It seemed as if all the light was being drawn into that black hole. I attempted to call out for help, but my vocal cords failed to respond. To conduct the research, I made sure that I did not sleep much. Coffee, pills, anything that could make me not sleep, and yet the figure was there. Every time exhaustion overcame me. It was then that I began getting those large black hand-shaped marks across the body, which had no reason. It was as if he was leading me into the dream because he wanted me so much. In despair, I returned to the journal. I desired for Evelyn to have found a way of getting out of that house, but what she wrote became more pathetic, more dismal. She recounts how he used to murmur her name, and how he once told her that she could not elude him. Her last entry was a single chilling sentence. "He is here." That night, I could barely stay awake. I slept, and when I woke up, the next thing I saw was the house. This time, I was in the attic again, near the old trunk where I had read the journal. The air was thick with expectancy, and the only audible noise that could be discerned was the sound of their breathing, punctuated by the squeak of the wooden floor. He was sitting alone when I turned around to look at him. He offers his hand further out from before. In other words, it was quite obvious throughout most of the film that he was cold. A shapeless darkness approached and said,
"You are now in my power."
His fingers closed around my wrist, and an icy hot sensation went through me, leaving me weak and struggling. The room started fading into the black abyss, and I realized that I was turning into the world of the subconscious. One morning, I awoke in my bed as usual, but things were not quite right. The absence of noise within the house was eerie, in a way that left one feeling almost uncomfortable. I stood up and headed towards the mirror. My reflection stared back, but the face was not quite right. The eyes were darker, the skin paler. I put my hand to my cheek, and it was as if I was touching another person. Those words of the figure were ringing in my head.
"You can't leave. You're mine now."
I knew with a sickening certainty that I was still asleep, but in a waking nightmare. Every time I opened my eyes, I was in his world, trapped and unable to escape, no matter how many times I woke up. Now, as I write this in the same journal, hoping that someone would read it and change before it becomes too late. But dreams are not mere figments of the imagination. They are gates, and there are some things in life that once they locate you, will pursue you relentlessly.